Welcome to Startup Hacks, a We Global podcast. We explore the stories and secret strategies that women entrepreneurs use to save time and money when bootstrapping and building their businesses. I'm your host, Fernanda Carapina. Welcome back to another episode of Startup Hacks. I'm your host, Fernanda Carapina, and today I'm very excited to welcome Katica Roy, who is a gender economist and the CEO of Pipeline, an award-winning SaaS company that leverages artificial intelligence to identify and drive economic gains through gender equity. The Pipeline platform was named one of Time Magazine's best inventions in 2019 and Fast Company's 2020 World's Most Innovative Companies. In 2020, Katica was named the 2020 Colorado Entrepreneur of the Year, and her articles in World Economic Forum, NBC, Fast Company, Fortune, Forbes, Bloomberg, Huffington Post, and others have garnered well over 1 billion impressions. So as you can see, she is just your regular gal. So welcome, Katica. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it is truly my pleasure, and thank you so much for making the time to do so. I really wanted to start the show off by giving the audience an opportunity to really understand who you are, where you came from, your family story. It's such an incredibly touching story, and I think for so many of us, myself included, who are not from the United States or whose families are not from America, and had that immigrant story, to really appreciate the journey and how you can just, reach supreme heights as you have and continue to do.
Thank you for having me. That is such a big part of who I am. So I'm a daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. I'll tell you a little bit about both my parents' stories. Obviously quickly, but my mother was an immigrant from Britain. She was actually an orphanage at the age of 18 months. She was born in 1939 on the Isle of Guernsey, which is in closer proximity to France than mainland England. And when France fell to the German army in 1940, Prime Minister Churchill doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles, and so he evacuated them. And my mom was the youngest of 5 children. She was separated from her mom and her siblings. And sorry, I missed a part of that. One of the things that Churchill did was actually evacuate the islands. And so my mom was one of the children that was evacuated, and she was separated from her mom and 4 siblings, placed into an orphanage and adopted a year later. And so and so she was adopted into a lovely family for sure. But I think, a lot of her growing up, and her mom had actually been a mother at 15. My mom was the last of her children, and she had 5 kids by the time she was 22. Not my mother, my grandmother. Wow. And so I think, my mom came here when she was 21, when she was an emancipated adult to the United States for opportunity and equality. And my father actually was a refugee. So he escaped from Hungary after the fall of the 1956 revolution. And he decided that it was actually better to risk his life and the lives of his 3 daughters. So my 3 eldest sisters, who at the time were 3, 7, and 8. And they walked across a minefield. They crossed the border into Austria and arrived to a refugee camp when President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the U.S. on Christmas Day, 1956. And they were on that plane. And so one of the things that I often think about and is this idea that whatever I'm going through, I was actually talking to one of our investors today about this, is that whatever I'm going through, it's still a privilege, because the frame of reference that I have for the difficulties and whatever the issues are that I'm going through is that they're all a privilege, because the frame of reference for me is the decision that my father made. And what I was raised with and my siblings were raised with was really this idea that we had an obligation to give back, that we had been privileged to, some of us either be born or be raised in this country. And so we had an obligation to do something with what was given to us.
Well, for the listeners who may not know you, I would encourage you to get to know Katica Roy, Google her, and the work that you are doing on behalf of women and around the whole topic of diversity and inequity is really incredible and to be commended. So I want to use our time wisely, and I definitely want to talk to you about the startup hacks piece, but I want to give you an opportunity to discuss your current journey and what you're really focused on now. I know obviously you started Pipeline and it's become a very successful company and has really become a platform for the work that you're doing. But there seems to be a real broader conversation that you're having publicly that's incredibly well timed.
Well, it was also incredibly well researched. So before I launched Pipeline, I actually I did a 100-page market feasibility study on the actual concept of starting the company. So I did a fair amount of research before I launched the company. But the idea, Pipeline's brand message, and obviously my broader brand message, is really around gender equity, not as a social issue, though we do believe that it is, but also gender equity as a massive economic opportunity that as companies and countries, and we've really seen this take hold this year in 2020 with COVID-19 and the economic fallout and the renewed calls for racial justice, that this is actually not only about the right thing to do, it's actually this massive economic opportunity that is fundamentally about equity for all. And so we talk about that in terms of, what the American taxpayer is actually paying for women to be paid inequitably, what it's costing us this year in our economic recovery when we don't actually invest equitably in women and particularly female-led households, and beginning to move the conversation forward in really two fronts. One, so that women aren't sort of sidelined to these women's issues, right? Women's issues are economic issues, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. So that's right. One piece, but also we tend to be kind of pigeonholed to just a few issues, but in actual fact, almost all issues can be viewed through the gender lens. And that just doesn't, not only for women, but also for men. And so we have had a lot of conversations, both with elected officials and public policy officials and others about this topic.
And what has the reaction been? I mean, do you find, you obviously developed a really great AI product that is used to really assess or evaluate how companies are doing against these metrics. Do you find that it's an easy sell, or are people still resistant to the idea?
We have seen an acceleration of that this year in particular. There was a lot of interest and push forward from companies before. They were largely companies that had already done some measure of work. So there are thousands of companies that have actually signed a public pledge committing to gender equity. The next step after that is, what have you actually done to live up to that pledge? And for the companies that have really tried to measure this, typically they start with the pay gap, not always. The other thing that they'll start with is representation. What they find is that it's a lot harder than they thought it was. It's not just a matter of measurement. How do you actually move the decisions forward, and particularly the people decisions? And there was talk about this earlier this year, particularly with the renewed calls for racial justice, that over $2 billion has been donated to racial justice causes, which is certainly very, very important. We also need to couple that with investments within companies' workforces, for their employees, and moving women and people of color, particularly women of color, up through the ranks in companies. And so we have seen an acceleration this year, and my hope is that going into 21, we'll be able to really accelerate that even further.
And was Pipeline your first startup, or was there any other entrepreneurial activity that preceded this?
This was my first startup. I was a corporate person through and through. You know, my last job was as a global vice president for a large enterprise company. I actually had a dad who was an entrepreneur, so I was not predisposed to being an entrepreneur. He had certainly some successes and some failures, and I thought this is a fairly rocky way to live your life. And so I spent 23 years in the corporate world before launching Pipeline. And the math for me was really this idea that I was at a point in my career that I could take the risk of going to be an entrepreneur and not being paid and investing in the company. And that if the worst happened and for some reason it failed, I actually had enough time to kind of make that up and go back to the corporate world. Thankfully, that's not the case, but still, that's certainly something. One of my friends who is an investment manager says you have to know what your ripcord line is. Like, you've got to know what like how far are you willing to go.
Right.
And I think that's a really good, it's a difficult conversation to have because you don't want to predispose yourself to failure, but it is also, it's not just a stress on you. Like, I have a family, so that was a conversation I needed to have with my husband, and we needed to continue to have, but I'm not, I probably was an intrapreneur. Like, I was always in the corporate world, my nickname was Special Ops. And the reason was because I would, like, they would essentially give me all the projects that nobody else wanted, that largely sat in two categories. One, where they were either at risk of failing, right? It was off track, over budget, over timeline, or it was net new, so high risk of failure. And I would actually bring those to fruition, operationalize them, and hand them off. Like, I loved that. That was something I really enjoyed doing. So I probably had that, but I also had that coupled with kind of a high need for security, right? Which is not typically something you think of as an entrepreneur. But I actually think that piece has made me a better entrepreneur in terms of, fiscal responsibility and those kinds of things.
And was it the idea for the company that spurred you to leave your corporate secure position and venture down this path? Or was it just the desire to be more independent and do your own thing?
It was my experience in the corporate world, actually. So I talked a little bit about my parents' experience, obviously being the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. I'm also the youngest of 6 kids, 5 girls, 1 boy. I watched my sisters and their families struggle because of their lack of economic opportunity due to gender inequity. A lot of the things that are the legacy of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, not being able to, used to be, in my lifetime, you could be fired for being pregnant. You couldn't get a credit card without a male cosigner. You couldn't get a loan without a male cosigner. And I watched my sisters struggle. And I remember as a little girl, obviously they're a fair bit older than I was, thinking, I just never want to do that. And then the other piece was my experience. So I'm a breadwinner mom for a family of 4. My husband is a stay-at-home dad, has been for the last 12 years. And I also fought to be paid equitably twice and won.
Wow.
And that had a lot. And I inherited other teams as well. So I inherited all of their inequities. And, really after the first time I fought to be paid equitably, I committed that if you reported to me, I would do everything in my power to ensure that both you were paid equitably, but you also had equity of opportunity. And I think as I went along, and I have kind of a varied background, I've got 3 degrees, an undergraduate degree in political science and legal studies emphasis. I've got a master's degree in computer science and cognitive science, and then an MBA, which probably set me up perfectly to launch the company. Yeah. But I really started to think through, what could I do to solve this problem? And if I was going to launch a company, I was certainly interested in making money, but I was really interested in solving this problem and talking about this issue differently than had ever been done really before. And that was my goal. And I think, quite frankly, certainly we haven't accomplished gender equity yet, but we have done a lot of very good work to move the conversation forward, to close gaps with our customers, et cetera.
Right. Well, as you know, I completely relate to that pain point. And it's interesting how there have been so many amazing women that I've met in the past year who all feel so strongly about it and are all really approaching the problem differently with different solutions, which is great because we do have to attack it from all sides. So once you started your company, I know you had kind of your idea of what your ripcord